Time magazine was the one that was also on the iPad, and you could compare it directly and sort of see what the technology added to the.
Excuse me.
So, can anybody tell me what you think makes a magazine a magazine? What makes it different?
The formatting.
Yes.
The stapler.
Okay, the fact that it's hooked together, it's certainly printed in a slightly different way. Any thoughts about why?
I don't know if you're.
So it doesn't fall apart. Maybe?
But why is it okay for a newspaper to fall apart and not a magazine? Yeah.
It's meant to like look like a book, more similar to a book than a newspaper.
Mm-hmm. Which might mean what compared to a newspaper? Yeah.
There's more colors. There's more pictures.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes people even call it magazine.
Yeah. I think there is a feeling that you might keep these for a longer period of time, that newspapers feel more disposable than magazines. They are made to seem like they might be something you would collect or keep. And it depends a lot on the magazine, but for example, this one, lots of people keep for years and years. You can find stacks of these everywhere. And they are nicely bound so that you can see the month and everything on the end. And so there is that feeling of magazines that maybe they would be kept longer, and that's why they're printed more nice in a better quality, that sort of thing. Anything else you notice that makes a magazine a magazine? Yeah.
Well, in a newspaper, you're kind of meant to flip just through it to where you want to read, whereas in a magazine, you're just meant to read from the cover to the cover.
You felt that? You felt like you were
I
more
think
likely
it's-
to read cover to
yeah.
cover?
I think, it's more focused, like, sometimes on a certain topic than newspapers.
That is a very true statement. In general, newspapers often exist one or two in a town, and they're meant to appeal to everybody in that town. That's their goal. Everybody could read this source of news. Whereas magazines are far more likely to specialize into little niches. So this is very focused on the economy, whereas this is very focused on travel, right? And what's going on around the world. This is more about specific hard news kind of things. Yeah.
In Czech, we say that there is nothing older than a newspaper from yesterday, and because the magazines are usually not really about news. It's usually just about some articles and to give you an idea about something. But the newspapers have to inform you about what's going on. But the magazines could bring up some really old data or new data or something and do interviews and stuff.
I think there are two main points in there that I would focus on. One is the time schedule of newspapers versus magazines. How are they different in how often they're published? Any ideas?
Newspaper every day.
Most
Yeah.
newspapers are every day,
Magazines once a week, maybe.
once a week, or even often once a month. It sort of depends. So what does that say about the kind of articles each one has to cover? If you're inventing every single day, what kind of information is likely to be in there? Yes?
Info, like little topics.
Yeah, not as
Well,
important because they need to put something in. So
Well, there are just
Exactly.
something, but they're very focused on the immediate, the now, right? As current as they can be. Newspapers are trying to get the latest news to you as quickly as possible. Whereas magazines, if you have a week or a month to digest a topic, you can go into a lot more depth, you can interview more people, you can make a much longer article
More
about it.
interesting.
Maybe more interesting, but certainly not the same focus, not the who, what, when, where, how, why of the
More
immediate,
in-depth.
but more
There you go.
exploring the topic, yes, and giving you more detail. And magazines are really good at that. Their articles are often longer, more complex, more in-depth articles.
Often you get like the context more for the story, the back information, the individual personal stories of the people involved in the news story. Whereas newspapers, once you ever go on and take journalism class, newspaper writing is the reverse pyramid, right? The broad topics go first, the who, what, where, why, and when, and then it slowly narrows to specific information towards the end. But the focus is just the facts, man, basically is the focus for most newspapers. Now, again, you got to understand, of course, is that there are differences. There are longer form pieces you'll occasionally find in newspapers, like the Sunday Times has a lot of like big, thick stuff, and there are some magazines that are mostly fluff and don't have deep, meaningful articles. So we're just talking general rules, but there are always exceptions. I mean, there are news magazines that are short and sweet also.
Anything you noticed about online versus the actual text magazines? Yeah.
Online tends to be more active. Like there's videos and stuff.
So more
Sometimes
interactive, something you can go and see that can't be in here, like a
Yeah.
video or a link to something else. Yeah.
Discussions about the topic, like in forums and so on.
That's wonderful. That's a great benefit of the
Yeah.
internet is that communication people can have very quickly and directly. That's okay. No big deal. So, magazines and newspapers are exploring some similar stuff online, right? They're trying to get more interactive. They do both have the paywall there that they're trying to get you to buy content. They give small amounts for free. They add more content there. They're often trying to get you to go to both places too. You know, they might have a different or an extended version in one place if they can get you to go to the other place and get more out of it.
In fact, didn't we see when we were looking through magazines, there were small advertisements in the paper magazine trying to push people online to get content, even though they paid for the magazine. You know, you have to go online to get the full effect in some cases.
Okay, any questions about newspapers and magazines before we move on to radio and TV today? Okay, so we're going to start with radio. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to go online. We're going to ask you to visit a couple places online while we listen as a group to some radio broadcasts. First, how many of you have used TuneIn? TuneIn.com? Yeah? You may use something else to get live streaming audio. You may go to 365, Live 365, or somewhere else like that. I like TuneIn because I'm going to show you a little bit about how it works in there. You're welcome to go and look as well. When I go to TuneIn main area, I can get lots of live streaming radio, but if I choose news to help me right now, and then I have even subtopics, I can choose world news because I'm not interested as much in local news. Now I get a list of different shows from all over the world, and if we scroll up just a little bit, we'll see that there are a little more, 472 listed here. Some of them come up right away. You can see we've got Korea, we've got BBC, we've got different places. We're going to go to one. Look for ABC Australia. They have a, keep going. Keep going.
You can just search it there.
You can, but it's going to pop up here.
World News ABC.
Okay, we're going to listen to World Today. On the actual slideshow that we presented to you and we shared with you that you guys can get to, there's links to the websites for these different things. If you would go search even in Google and find World Today ABC, I would like you to pull up their website so you can look at what content they offer online while we listen to some of their news program, okay? So I want you to see what they have on their website. So go find
And let's
World
buy today,
Today.
Thursday, November 7th. This is the
They're on
world.
PRI.
Oh, this is PRI? It says ABC.
It's
Oh,
like
sorry.
that. Yeah, still left
There we
over
go.
this time.
Well, staying in London overnight, a young Australian corporal was granted a private audience with the Queen in recognition of his services in Afghanistan. Daniel Allen Kieran was presented with Australia's highest military honour, the Victoria Cross, a year ago. In London, Barbara Miller reports.
Daniel Kieran is getting used to the limelight. He's Australia's 99th and most recent recipient of the preeminent award for bravery in war. He was presented with the Victoria Cross last year by the Governor-General Quentin Bryce in the presence of the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard. He's since met Hillary Clinton and now even the Queen, an appointment he admits was a little nerve-wracking.
Because it's like when you meet some of these people, as in, important people, you know, you've seen them on TV or you've seen them around before, and then you actually meet them for the first time. You know, you get, you know, a few butterflies, but I think it went off quite well.
Cameras were allowed to film the beginning of that meeting, a slightly stilted affair in which Corporal Kieran made small talk about the great British weather.
Is this the first time you've been here?
Yes, it is. I'd say it's my first one. Yeah. The weather's been awesome. So.
It's different.
It's different, yeah. It's
Daniel Kieran wouldn't say what was discussed once the cameras were ushered out of the room, but did reveal that he brought a gift for Her Majesty.
got to turn up the something, don't you?
The present was a book of photographs of Kalgoorlie. That's where the BC recipient and his wife live these days, far from his home state of Queensland, and a very long way from his life as a serving soldier in Afghanistan. Corporal Kieran, still an active reservist, left full-time military service a year after the Battle of Derepet. It was there in August 2010 that he, with what was described as complete disregard for his own safety, repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire in order to identify their positions. When a mate was hit, he did it again, to draw fire this time away from the wounded soldier and those treating him. The soldier, Lance Corporal Jared McKinney, didn't make it, and that is still clearly hard for Daniel Kieran to accept.
Look, I did lose a mate that day, and it's been, you know, it's been a few years now. I am a little bit more comfortable talking about it, but.
Okay, so just a little sample of radio. Tell me what you noticed. What do you know about radio news? What's your, how do we define what makes radio news radio news?
There's no visual.
Okay, there is no visual. That's what does that mean for radio news, do you think, that they have no visuals?
Well, they have to describe the story more.
Okay, so the description level they need, maybe the use of sound and other things becomes very important. Yeah?
Yeah, because they are not visible, the radio listeners just come in makeup and clothes. It's not that's first thing, but it's not important. The important thing is that in the radio, it must be as short as possible and as informative as possible, because no one really wants to listen just in 1 hour, I don't know, 1 hour or something. So it has to be short, and they can say, like, for more info, go there.
Now they can. They didn't used to be able to before the internet. Yeah?
Voice, strong.
The voice, yeah, the voice has been key, right? Having the right radio voice, having a good voice for radio.
If there's someone who's like mumbles, then it's that.
Right. So you could be a journalist who writes very well, but you might not be the right person for communicating somewhere where there's an audio feature. What's the difference maybe between radio and magazines and newspapers? What advantages or disadvantages does radio have compared to print media? Huh?
You don't have to.
Right. So where is that an advantage?
Well, because for example, when you're in the car, it's listening to it.
Right. A lot of radio news now is actually very much focused on drive time.
Yeah.
They put a lot of news programming at that time when people are most likely to be in their car.
Because everyone at home just turn on their TV and listen to radio.
Yeah, TV, or you can just watch the news on the internet.
Or download
But
it.
yeah, but with radio, you have to focus on just one thing. But if you read the article, and also I don't know these.
Okay. So how many of you in your house people listen to the radio? You hear radio news on in your house?
In the car.
Just in the car. Nobody in the house is listening to it? Okay. Just curious. Okay, so what advantage is there in why would radio be considered a very accessible source for people all over the world? What makes radio more accessible than some other types of sources? Yeah.
It's free.
It's essentially free. How much do you have to invest to be able to listen to radio?
Just to the radio.
You have to have a basic radio and what? Either electricity or batteries. So even somewhere that doesn't have regular electricity, doesn't receive regular newspapers, doesn't have enough money to buy a TV, radio is still possible, right? It's the most available anywhere in the world. So in developing countries, it's still maybe a major major player, especially outside of big cities. Yeah.
And also, if you have the TV thing, you have to send not only data of sound but also data of I don't know, video or something. But to the radio, you have to have just sound, so you can put it any way you want.
It's probably easier to make radio broadcasts than TV.
From a technical standpoint, that's absolutely
Because
true.
you don't need a visual.
Right, it's cheaper to make
All you
radio
need is a
programming. You're right.
microphone and one of those transmitters.
Right.
The transmitter, this might be a question where it's accessible. I think places that don't have access to to buy a satellite, for example, but yet can have airwaves, those are television stations that transmit. So old technology is still very accessible in places that hasn't gotten satellite technology, getting an actual dish. So when you look at for example in the Middle East, stories of places that get transmitters but not yet catching satellite.
Yeah, and the nature of broadcasting over radio, the other upshot of that is that you can broadcast at people. I mean, do we have any RFE families here in this room right now? We have lots of them at the school, Radio Free Europe. I mean, that's a whole concept of us paying for a radio station and broadcasting it across a border in order to produce some kind of political change inside the country, which is possible with television. Like, there is air television broadcast, but it doesn't have the distance or the clarity that radio has. Shortwave radio, actually, I could pick up shortwave radio broadcasts from New York here right now if I had shortwave radio. So it really can be broadcast around the world. Whereas television, you have a certain distance. There has to be a transmitter in every city, basically. So for producing social change with the media, that's why Radio Free Europe has been so successful, and Voice of America and stuff like that.
I've got a couple terms up here that I sort of noticed when I listened to radio. Top of the hour. When is top of the hour? Do you know when that would be?
Oh yeah, like when you're in the car.
The top of the hour is like a clock thing. It's the very beginning. So it's
Yeah.
the first 5 minutes of the hour.
People don't know how to read normal clocks anymore.
Yes.
They're all digital now. They couldn't even read that
So-
clock if they wanted to.
On most news radio, top of the hour is when the headlines, the breaking news, the most important things that are going on right now are in the programming. And so the first 5 minutes usually has what's the big important news going on that we know about right now, the headlines. Whereas the rest of the show tends to be stories they've had time to prepare, right? And so they're more like a story, just like what we listen to, where they're interviewing somebody and sharing a longer piece of news. Most radio stations and TV news stations have what they call a jingle. Do you know what the term jingle is? Yeah, it's some familiar set of notes or music that you associate very much with that show. It becomes very much a connection, and you hear that.
Yeah, like the news music
Yes, just like news music.
with a metro sound.
I'm gonna skip support and come back to it because Mike's gonna address that better than me. A host or an anchor is also very associated with specific programming. If you think about TV news, which you may be more familiar with, there is somebody who sits at the desk who anchors it, right? And then they send you out to see different stories from different people. The same is true on the radio. One person manages it, starts the program, tells you what's going to come up, and then it goes to the individual journalists who are reporting their story. But there's one person who it comes back to over and over again throughout the program. And primary sources. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah, you want to ask what's the support again?
Mike's going to talk about that in just a second. I went out of order. Primary sources. What are primary sources? Do anybody know?
Like, we get the information from, so for example, first-hand information. I don't know if you got information straight from the president.
Right. Radio made a big leap, I think, in primary sources from what magazine and newspapers do, whereas they use short quotes from people. Radio then began to interview people, and you really got to hear people's stories in their own words. That's a very strong part of radio programming, is being able to listen to somebody whose house was just burned down, and they talk to you about how painful that is, and you can feel it because you can hear it. So both radio and TV do a lot of that, going to a person who's living that experience and really including them in the story. So you get to hear what they say. Okay, support.
Just briefly, I think one thing that's really important to recognize when you're learning about radio. Radio is one of those things where you go around the world and many countries, not all countries, but many countries still have their government sort of official, taxpayer-supported radio stations. And they're very different animals from private for-profit radio stations. The BBC is a great example. You listen to BBC World Service News, fairly high quality, but there's no advertisements really on BBC World Service. I mean, the reason for that is somewhat obvious. The government pays their bills. They get a grant from the government, so they don't need advertising revenue. It's not like they're superior or they're any better necessarily. It's just a whole different model of how they get their funding. In the United States, it's a little bit different because National Public Radio, although they do get a little bit of money from the government, they are also supplemented by donations. Public television in the United States doesn't get a lot of government money. They do get a little bit. But mostly it's donor supported. You'll go in, if you've ever lived in the States, you've probably seen a donor drive for public television. They come on, they're like, please call in and donate $20 so you can see all these great shows, this kind of thing. But they don't normally have a lot of advertising either. That's changing a little bit. If you go to PBS and watch some of their shows, you'll notice that some of the shows are sponsored by this, that, or the other thing. But they still don't have regular commercials in the way that you would see in private television. So my only point here is, especially when you're listening to radio, because, Czech radio has it, Canadian radio, BBC, various different forms in Canada and the United States. There's a big difference between public radio and private radio. Private radio, it's pretty obvious where they get their money. They sell ads. If you listen to AM radio in the United States, it's like car dealership ads every 5 seconds. So there is a huge difference on the radio between public radio and private radio. So when you're listening to various things, keep that in mind. Like, who's paying the bills here? It should be fairly obvious. BBC, that's the British Broadcasting Corporation. It's pretty easy to tell who owns that. So just bear that in mind. That's only the kind of focus about support.
What did you notice about what was online? Did you go to the website? Were you looking at the website when it was up here? What does the online presence for the radio offer? What makes it valuable to visit? Yeah.
You can listen to specific stories.
Okay, so you can focus to a specific story and find out more about it. And there is both bonus content and often the same content.
Sometimes there's also a transcription.
The transcript is excellent. I think it's a wonderful feature of moving radio into the digital world. For example, if I'm listening to a story on my drive, and then I think, ooh, I should bring that up in class, that's a great resource. I can go get the exact transcript. Who said what? You could use it for a report. You were just listening, but you needed to use it in some report you were doing for class. You could get exact quotes there that you might have missed while you were listening. What else did you notice about the online version? What's the benefit of the fact that there is live streaming and live streaming radio? How is
It's more fun.
okay?
It's live streaming right now.
Is there? We were listening to shows that in fact aren't live right this moment.
That's not really live streaming.
I know. So I'm asking you, what about that? What about the fact that I can get shows that aired 10 hours ago?
Maybe if you want something that happened earlier in the week or earlier in the day, you can go back and hear that again.
Yeah, but if I have a favorite show and I live here but it's airing in the United States during normal hours and I want to listen to my show, especially in news shows, you may find this, you may find something that connects with you. You can get it when you're available, right? How about podcasts? Any of you listen to podcasts? Yeah. Oh, somebody who knows what it is. Tell us what's a podcast.
Well, it's kind of like a radio. It's there's a person that they talk to himself, sometimes live streams it, and then he posts it on the internet and you can listen to it again.
Right. So you can get it on demand, but another thing is it's available through iTunes, and you can subscribe to
Not all of it,
podcasts. Right, you can subscribe to a lot of podcasts. So, let's say, for example, I'm interested in book reviews. Okay? That's one of those things I like. National Public Radio has lots of different programming through the day. At the end of each week, they take every book review they did on every one of their different shows and put it in one podcast and push it to me. And then I can listen to it when I'm, let's say, going on a run.
And also more focused on the topic.
It can be focused, or it can actually just be a segment of a live programming. It could be that show, that whole show from beginning to end. But the point of that subscription is that it gets pushed to you, and then you can listen to it at your convenience, and you don't have to be there when it's airing.
And a lot of the time, radio is more news, and podcasts can be different things like stories.
It can be all sorts of things. There are definitely podcasts that are not part of regular streaming radio. Somebody can create their own audio podcast themselves and make that available. But radio is making big use out of that because it's an audio format as well, to then push that out and have people access their programming at their own convenience.
I'm just going to recommend as you're talking, Ms. Shaer and Mr. Peters are sharing a lot of links with you. Hyperlink these to your notes. You're taking notes and you're tagging these on your bookmark or you're bookmarking these, but just also go ahead and in your notes make the actual hyperlink to these sites because they're very valuable sites for you.
And we sort of skimmed over the historical radio, some of the earliest radio broadcasts, but they are wonderful to listen to.
Let me just show you this right here. If you go to archive.org, which has an archive of much old stuff online, they basically have a decade-by-decade sorted collection of news broadcasts from various different decades. So this is the whole category of them, but you'll notice we've got 1938, 1970 to 1979, here's the 60s. So if you want to go in and listen to some really like how it actually sounded to hear the radio back in those days, you can just click on the time period you want, and then with any luck, there'll just be a player up on the side where you can just listen to it as if you were getting into the hot tub time machine and going back to the 60s to listen. So some of the stuff is full broadcasts of full radio things, and then some of them are just little segments. Yeah, take the direct link from the slideshow is probably the easiest thing to do, because it'll take you right to the right radio page. Anyway, we won't go through all of that right now, but it is interesting by way of comparison how radio sort of changed over time. So you can go listen to those things, if you're interested on your own time. Also, if you're interested, one thing I didn't get a chance to show you, just quick, I put a couple more of those crazy vintage documentaries up there. This one's about both about newspapers and magazines. It's some pretty funny stuff, like how it produces, like how women's magazines in the 50s and the 30s are produced. It's on the slideshow, just out of interest. You can go check that out as well.
Very cool.
There's a lot of stuff there you can watch for fun or for interest. Yeah. So. No, but if you go to the RFE website, you can listen to RFE online.
I actually went and looked at Radio Free Europe. It's in TuneIn as well.
Yeah.
But there's not a lot of English broadcasting, which is kind of why I chose other things. A lot of Radio Free Europe is in the languages of the countries that they're broadcasting to.
Yeah.
The first ISP.
Of course we do.
Absolutely, I agree.
Yeah.
I did this with the archive you showed us. I typed some like president's name and stuff, so I can read like what
Sure.
they think about it.
I mean, RFE is an interesting case. There are some people that would say, RFE has a certain agenda, right? They have now, it's one most of us agree with. It's like a democratic agenda. But if you're analyzing something for bias, of course, I mean, this is a whole radio station that's been created specifically to bring about political change in other countries. I mean, that is a definite bias. Now, hopefully it's a bias most of us agree with. We believe in democracy and freedom and all that great stuff. But it is a certain perspective, right? And that's something that's really important to recognize, is that it's being produced to achieve a certain purpose.
Alright, we're going to explore television a little bit, and then come back and sort of talk about the differences between radio and television, and again, back to print. What differences do we see?
Okay. I'm not going to start with television, because of course the first moving images used for news didn't happen inside of a television set. It happened, where would it have happened if not on a television? Where do you get to see visual news for the very first time? Yeah, in theaters, you get to see newsreels. So before I dig into this, I just want to sort of take you down a little bit of a timeline, just very quickly to show you how one of these media kind of plays into another and how this whole thing evolved. Just real quick, just so we can sort of put it in order here. The first large public radio station in the United States was in Pittsburgh in 1921, I believe, is when real big network broadcasting really started in the United States. So for about 20 years, radio was it, right? 1941 was probably the first year, give or take, that television was broadcast out to anybody, any significant numbers. But what you'll find is, because of the war, World War II, progress towards television spreading all over the place actually stopped during the Second World War. Most of the engineers and the journalists were off covering the war or in the war themselves. And so television kind of took a step back for the duration of the Second World War. And then you get into the late 40s, 1946, 1947, the war is over, and then suddenly in the United States, television studios get opened up all over. So technically, it's probably around 1940 that television news really gets started. But it really doesn't start picking up until after the Second World War. The other thing that you guys might find interesting, by way of a bit of a backstory, is mostly people who bought television stations in those early days, they were all owners of radio stations. So radio comes first. They make lots and lots of money. National radio networks like CBS, NBC, these people still exist today in the United States. They started out as national radio networks. They took all the money they made making radio and they invested it in buying television stations, even though, at the time at least, they weren't making any money at television because nobody owned television. They just started dumping their profits into television because they figured this was the next big thing. They figured correctly. So you'll notice with early television news, it is basically the same stuff that they were doing on radio, just with a camera there. So this whole idea that newscasts are just a guy sitting at a desk, like reading the news, that all comes from radio, because of course that's what you do on radio. You sit at a desk, you read the news. So early television broadcasts were just radio broadcasts with a camera there. And you're going to see a little bit of that right now when we get at it. So the first thing I'm going to show you is actually it's actually a newsreel that comes, you would have watched this in the theater. The date of this is 1937. The reason that this particular clip is significant is that it's one of the first examples of a film crew actually catching news live on camera while it happens. So this is the first, not the first, but one of the first examples of a film crew actually catching news live in a visual way. Pretty interesting stuff. So you've probably heard of this news event before, hopefully. It's very famous, and one of the reasons it's famous is it's one of the first times this type of stuff is caught on television. Or on video. Sorry, or on film. And the reason they catch this on film is just a coincidence. They were there to film the Hindenburg's arrival. They weren't there to film the disaster. It's just a coincidence that they're there rolling when the thing explodes.
Now lies at the Naval Air Station a twisted mass of metal. Shortly after these pictures were taken, showing the great skyliner saluting the millions.
Listen to the soundtrack that they use and the dramatic narration.
while Dr.
You can imagine this being shown in a movie theater. They draw lots of like stylistic notes from the actual films.
Hours late on its trip from Hamburg because of headwinds, the Zeppelin had to ride out a thunderstorm along the Jersey coast before heading for the air station and nosing its way to the morning
People
mass.
going to movie theaters didn't see movies with special effects or any crazy crap like that. This kind of footage is brand new to people. Nobody has ever seen stuff like this before. Except in between cartoons and movies, the first time this comes up on the air.
10 minutes or so, the great aircraft would have been snugly docked. But as the passengers crowded the windows to watch, a roar and a burst of flame near the big tail fins turned the ship into a flaming inferno.
Yeah. It's very cinematic the way they've done this, right?
Passengers and crew, the fortunate among them, fell or jumped and were dragged to safety before the fiery furnace took their lives. Heroic work by Navy and Army men risking their lives around the white-hot skeleton.
I just love the soundtrack. It's almost like a Charlie Chaplin film or something, right?
From the blazing wreckage. But for the most of those trapped in the incandescent tangle, there was no hope. It's the greatest of miracles that anyone came out of the disaster alive.
Can you imagine, this is the first time journalists have footage like this. What do you do with it? How do you present it in a way that's appropriate but also going to sell newsreels, right? They're just figuring out what to do.
For an hour or more, with its dense black smoke making a pall over the tragic.
I mean, I can imagine sitting in an old movie theater seeing this. Like, feel like what it would be like. And then the Bugs Bunny comes on, and then it's great, right?
This is the worst, the most terrible. Hailed as the luxury liner of the air, the Hindenburg's horrible end has shocked the entire world. Pride of the skies reaches its journey's end.
Sweet. So. Yep. 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 So there you go. Earliest days of visual news, right? Maybe one of the very first famous clips in all of visual news. Okay, so this goes on for some years. 1937, 38. Newsreels in theaters actually continued well into the 1960s. And then the whole drive-in thing started to happen, and it became less popular to show like double features, news, cartoons all at once. It became more of go to the movies and see a movie. So newsreels continue into the 60s, but we're going to leave those alone. And I'm going to show you one of the very first regular television newscasts to appear on a regular basis, like every single night. Before this happened, all news on television was either radio broadcasts, sort of rejigged for news, or even newsreels just played on television. Stuff that was filmed by people intending to show them in theaters, but they just showed them on television instead. But this is the first example, NBC, of a newscast that was on every single night. And what made this special, unlike in the movie theaters, this is one of the first examples of today's news being shown today. Whereas a film crew took the Hindenburg, you would have seen that Hindenburg footage for months in the movie theater.
And I had already just marked that Hindenburg archive as one of the pivotal events. So
Yeah.
if you didn't write that down in your notes, please do. Because this, I mean, in history, a lot of what Mr. Peterson and Shaer are giving to us are examples of document analysis. When you analyze these in history, all what's being said are ways that you would analyze in history. So you're analyzing it as people would see it in the era it was first presented.
So this is, what I'm going to show you here, one of the earliest news broadcasts. Now, how news evolved, they evolved from, okay, we're just going to copy stuff on radio and stuff in newsreels and put them on the television. Then they started regular newscasts. At first, what are they now, usually, newscasts? Anybody? Half an hour sometimes. So at first, usually a half an hour. Back in these days, 15 minutes was the regular newscast. So this whole newscast is 15 minutes. We're not going to watch 15 minutes. I'm just going to show you the first couple minutes, just to give you a feel for it. there's a couple other things that makes this pretty interesting and pretty hilarious, in my humble opinion. Here it is. This is NBC Presents. This is one of their first nightly newscasts. Watch how hilarious this is.
The makers of Camel cigarettes bring the world's latest news events right into your own living room. Sit back, light up a Camel, and be an eyewitness to the happenings that made history in the last 24 hours.
Look.
The Camel News Caravan presents Today's News Today.
Getting today's news today was such a big deal, that's what they named the show. It was a miracle to get today's news on the air today instead of filmed and shown for months after.
Senator Nixon, the Republican vice presidential candidate, was receiving what amounted to a private salary, an extra salary, from private persons in California, is becoming a major political story.
Okay, I'm going to turn the volume down a little bit because it's kind of boring. But I want you to notice, a lot of the things that are familiar in today's newscasts, you're actually seeing in this one of the very earliest ones, right? You've got, yeah, I was going to say that. You got the anchor guy, right? You've got the world map in the background, right? He's talking into the camera. He just, it's called the throw, right? Is when an anchor throws it to another journalist to finish the story. He just did that in one of the very first newscasts. So not really a lot has changed with the form of newscasts right up until the 24-hour news stations, which changed things quite a bit. I'll give you a couple more minutes of this. Like Ike was that was the presidential slogan for when Eisenhower was running with Nixon. I like Ike, you like Ike. No, you weren't there. I was there. Right. Richard Nixon. Honest man. That turned out well. Alright, I'm just going to fast forward it just a little bit because I just want to show you the very first set of commercials because I think they're pretty funny. Oh wait, they're back. Look, he doesn't even know he's on yet, right?
He was like drawing.
Yeah. But you still see them do that today, pretending that they're making notes, right?
It was staged.
Yeah.
They pretend they're making
But wait.
The Camel Camera. Here's John Wayne, America's #1 movie star. He's enjoying time out with his new picture, Big Jim McLean, with a Camel cigarette.
You want to find how enjoyable a cigarette can be? Do what I did. Smoke only Camels for 30 days.
That's a 30-day challenge for you.
There's your 30-day challenge, straight from John Wayne.
Man,
Smoke Camels every
like,
single day.
this.
You heard it here first. You heard it here first. Okay, so
This must be like really old when they actually used to advertise this.
well, not only that, like, get your mind wrapped around that. The whole newscast is not brought to you by a bunch of different commercials. The entire thing is bankrolled by Camel cigarettes. The name of the thing is, what is it called? It's the Camel News Caravan, all right? I mean, that's unbelievable. And in fact, incredible when you think later on the 70s and 80s and 90s where the cigarette companies are the story, right? Because they're lying to people. They're telling people they can smoke for 30 days as part of the 30-day challenge. It's amazing to think that you know, cigarette companies basically bankrolled early television news. It's incredible stuff.
What year is this?
Is there a possibility?
52.
So they didn't know that.
It's a good question. Some people would tell you that the cigarette companies knew.
Could I like find this on YouTube? Like,
Yeah,
at least
yeah,
that
yeah.
commercial.
Yeah.
Because that would be like the best.
If you want cigarette commercials, I got hundreds of.
No, I just want that one because then on the website that I use, it's like a blogging website. There's always like 30-day challenge for like shows and stuff like that. I'd be like the original 30-day challenge.
Yeah,
Smoke
sure.
Camel.
Yeah. Anyway, you can have a copy of this if you want. It's all public domain stuff. Cool. So there's some television news. Now, the other thing I think is really important, just from a historical perspective, right? No big deal. John Wayne, Camel, smoking some cigarettes and stuff. It's all good. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, television sort of ingrained itself into the popular culture because, I'm talking mostly about America, I apologize for non-Americans or non-North Americans, I'm not American either, but most of this history was written through the United States. Sorry, I lost my train of thought, went off the rails.
What's next?
Right.
After this, your 50s, 60s, 70s, what's going on?
Oh, right. Key events which led people to really make television part of their lives in a really significant way. We talked a little bit earlier about how radio has become sort of the perfect medium for background noise, like while you're driving or doing other things where you need to have your hands and eyes fixed elsewhere. And it's interesting to note, actually, it used to be people would actually gather around the radio like it was a television to listen to shows. That really stopped happening when television came around. But there are a couple really significant events where pretty much in the United States and around the world, everybody was watching the exact same news unfold. And that doesn't happen much anymore. Maybe September 11th, I guess. You guys probably don't remember it, but that was a day when the entire world was basically watching the same event unfold on television, which is a really interesting experience. Television becomes a way that we can all share an event together. Well, that stuff started in the 50s and the 60s. One of the key events was the moon landing. That's probably one like grandparents or great-grandparents. Everybody of that era remembers where they were when the moon landing happened. They were all sitting around the television, and there were only 3 or 4 television stations in all of America, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm watching MTV or A&E or all this crazy crap. When you're watching TV, you're watching the exact same thing that your neighbor is. Often, you didn't have a television in every home, so everybody in the same neighborhood is together watching the same thing. So if you can imagine an event like, let's see, where is it? Well, let's say you're watching this cooking show, right?
Put the zipper holding the hood in because it's easier to put the
home economics show of some kind.
With the zipper than it is with the snaps. Then there's zippers up the side so that the jacket will fit tightly around the hips, keeping that straight, sleek look that it should have. And very often you'll find a zipper hidden in the arm.
Wait.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You'll excuse the fact that I'm out of breath, but about 10 or 15 minutes ago, a tragic thing, from all indications at this point, has happened in the city of Dallas. Let me quote to you this. And you'll excuse me if I am out of breath. A bulletin, this is from the United Press from Dallas. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally have been cut down by assassins' bullets in downtown Dallas. They were riding in an open automobile when the shots were fired. The president, his limp body carried in the arms of his wife Jacqueline, is rushed to Parkland Hospital. And if you'll excuse me if I give some directions and we talk about what we're going to do here for the next few minutes, but Bobby, let's tape this, if you please, particularly the interview with the eyewitness people. It is being taped good.
I think that's a little microphone. But they spoke on camera.
From the United Press in Dallas. President Kennedy has been shot in Dallas. Has been shot in Dallas, Texas. He was shot as the motorcade left downtown Dallas.
Oh, the president just got shot.
Mrs. Kennedy jumped up and grabbed the president. She cried, "Oh no," as the motorcade sped on. An Associated Press photographer, James Algens, 8LTGENS, reports he saw blood on the president's head. The AP man said he heard 2 shots but thought someone was shooting fireworks until he saw the blood on the president. He also said he saw...
So President Kennedy is known for many things, but one of the ways that he's known is he's really the first real television president, where his addresses were broadcast to people, his election was broadcast to people, his children kind of grew up in the glare of cameras, which is totally familiar today. It's like, oh, whatever. But JFK really became a famous politician, and died on television, pretty much his whole life is documented on television, including his death. I'm sure you've seen the other footage of it as well. So again, it's just an indication of how television is becoming totally linked to history and the way people experience history in a way that other media, it's not the same thing. Reading newspapers about something that's happening is different than everybody is sitting around the television watching this thing unfold together. And people get like a real collective, we are experiencing this event together in a way that hadn't really ever happened before. Today, it's commonplace, right? There's a hurricane hits New York, and everybody experiences it together by tweeting, and you get to see what's happening here, that, and the other. You actually get to hear the people, and the people experience this stuff together. It's commonplace today. But these events, and I'll just give you a couple examples, I won't play anymore. Another really pivotal event where TV news sort of like leached itself into people's brains, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That was one of the first examples. I don't have the actual footage of the first newscast, I couldn't find it, but it was one of the first breaking news, blah, 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 and a television guy would break in and tell the world the story. Another really popular one, I said the moon landing. I do have the moon landing here. I'll show you the moon landing because I think it's hilarious.
Do you have the Twin Towers as well?
No,
Yeah,
but
we'll show that maybe.
but that is like the contemporary sort of parallel to what I'm showing you here, right? But check this out. This is kind of hilarious. We won't watch the whole thing because it's 10 minutes.
We don't mind.
So this is Apollo 11 on the way to the moon for the very first moon landing, right? But the hilarious part about it is most of this is what was being played live on television. But you see this shot. This is a fake shot. CBS faked half of this footage, right? There is some real footage mixed in here. But obviously, where is the camera?
Yeah.
Like, where is the camera filming this? This is like the first ship.
Why is it like tilted?
So,
It's like laying down.
our perception of what is okay to put on news as news, like, they prepared a lot of this, right? We won't watch all of it. It's a lot of this, right?
It's so interesting. You know, usually like, oh, mistakes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that. There was like the flag waving.
Right.
Blowing in the wind.
So yeah, like how's that? It's not possible. So it's true because but I think the beauty of this is that now we are a much more savvy audience because we know since we put information on the web, we are writers of news ourselves.
Yeah.
So therefore we're like the media has changed.
Yeah.
In what they can do to the public audience and to the media.
I mean, the other interesting historical note about this footage, you guys are studying like prominent people in broadcasting. This is Walter Cronkite doing the broadcasting, and this is one of the he's one of.
Where's this?
Oh, I'm not listening to that. That's some kind of battleship somewhere, probably Cape Canaveral.
Oh my god.
And it's not exactly the greatest footage in the world, but there's more. Wait, there's more. Look at this shot.
What?
This is actually real footage. This. Amazing. Yep. It's shooting downwards out of the actual capsule. But this, of course, how'd they get the camera there before they landed there the first time? It's like...
They dropped it there.
Anyway, here we go. Here's some more footage. It's really great at the end. Look, and this is more great footage.
Is that top footage? Is that actual footage?
This looks like.
Coming from what camera?
This looks like.
They haven't landed on the moon yet. Where's the camera?
This is like E.T.
With the footage from the top, is that actual footage?
Yeah, that
It
footage.
looks like a helicopter.
Yeah. So here, look, this is great. Oh, perfect. All right, I just want to get the end a little bit with Cronkite comes in there. There's Cronkite. But part of the experience of the world experiencing this together, watch the reactions of the anchors that are watching this. They're just like, they're gobsmacked. He's trying to keep his composure online, but again, it's difficult for you guys to appreciate how mind-blowing this moment is. Oh yeah, sorry. This is an important simulation. They set this up on a sound stage to like fill in the dead air. It's just so funny.
It's all fake.
Again, not all of it.
They're labeling it. This is.
The audio is all real. It's like mission control. Not so much. All right. Not so real. Not so real.
Good job.
So there's all kinds of things you can take from that, right? The collective experience of experiencing important world events, and blah blah blah. But also, I mean, it's mind-boggling to me that, I mean, this is before TV news ethics and things like that. But the idea that you could create, this is like the most important news event in the entire world, and somebody thought to themselves, yeah, this is totally acceptable to fake 90% of this footage. I mean, I guess you had to get people to watch it. I guess they're not going to watch a black screen, but, you know.
Okay, so
Yeah.
let's talk about what makes TV its own medium. What makes TV TV?
Visual.
Okay, adding the visual component is a very big part of it. What else? What else how else would we define TV news being different from other sources?
It's shown on TV.
They do not have to describe everything because something can be shown.
Yeah.
Right, so the description may be less important. I was telling the other class, I used to have this cartoon, and the kid on it was talking about in TV, they show you the pictures and they give you the sounds. In radio, they give you the sound, but you get to make up your own pictures in your mind. And when you read a book, you get to make up everything, right? You get to see what they look like, what they're sounding like. All of that is up to your imagination. And the idea being, right, that it's more exciting to read. I realize it's much more passive to watch, right? It requires less energy from you. You can do it without doing much of anything. Just sit there and absorb. What else about news? What about TV news? Is there anybody who has ever watched TV news?
Yeah, from time to time.
A little CNN occasionally, or BBC, or local news? How is it structured? How is it structured? If you watch a news broadcast, how do they structure it?
They do the serious news first.
These days, they do a lot of advertising, both before the newscast and during the newscast, about something that's coming up in the newscast. Usually, that thing they're promoting is what? How would you describe the thing they always promote?
The most current
Maybe current?
advertisements.
I would argue that they usually give you something totally sensational, right? Something that will be super high interest, but
Something that they know that everyone knows.
right, and a lot of times,
Big events,
it's misleading, right? They're like, you've got to watch this next episode, or some crazy man is going to come in the middle of the night and attack your family. And so they get you to like think, I got to see that.
Yeah, what do you that
Threatening.
like wait until it's happened, it leaves you hanging. Sometimes cliffhanger literature, but also a hook. So it leaves you on a cliffhanger to watch the next episode. It's coming.
Also on news, they usually report like sad news and tragedies more than they put like more.
And again, that's that sensational aspect.
That's because more people will watch it. More people are interested in like car crashes and people dying.
Why do you think in news, TV news, more than maybe the other mediums, they have to have something that's so sensational? Why do they need to do that? What's the difference between somebody sitting and watching TV and buying a newspaper and sitting and reading it? What's in your hand while you're watching TV?
TV remote.
Food.
TV remote, that's true. Because when I'm watching TV, there are hundreds of channels now, right? If they're not keeping my attention, I can go watch something else. Whereas like if I'm watching The Big Bang Theory, right, it's a story. I watch from beginning to end. But news is a bunch of little episodes. And at any time, if I lose interest, I can change the channel. So current TV news works very, very hard to keep you somehow attached through the program. And so they don't put the big, interesting stuff, that hook at the beginning.
Yeah, exactly.
They make you wait and wait and wait for it, that one thing you were waiting for.
Sometimes they put like short 10-second description of it,
Mhm.
and then they put it later on.
Right, and they might say, coming up, and
Yeah,
they
they-
make you think it'll be right there, and then, you know,
Yeah.
20 minutes later, you're like, coming up will be this one thing you've wanted to see the whole time.
And then it turns out you were the interest.
Right, then it was totally misleading, and it wasn't nearly as exciting as they made it sound it was going to be.
Can we just recap the major events you just saw on TV news history? So what were some of the big events in history that people saw for the first time live on TV? What do you remember? Did you write it down in your notes? The landing on the moon? What else? Hindenburg.
Although that wasn't live as such.
Right, newsreel. That was newsreel. So people
That was
saw it.
edited.
Yeah.
Cut it off.
It was the first, like, catching a live footage.
And what other event?
Kennedy.
Kennedy's assassination. Exactly. So,
So
and we
they
haven't
actually
talked about
like
Vietnam
interrupted
War,
the
but
kitchen.
we'll maybe address that some other time.
Well, did they have the Vietnam War?
So Vietnam War is the
Oh,
first
yeah.
war that was televised. And why it became such a protest war is because people actually saw images for the first time in their living rooms. And before that, they hadn't. So World War II was highly overseas, it was distant. And suddenly, Vietnam saw people being shot in their living rooms. They could see the images from home. So, but now we're going to, yes, newsreels are
Yeah.
showing.
The other big thing that changed, newsreels, there is lots of newsreel footage of World War II. But one thing you want to talk about bias and media falling into the bias, especially in World War II, a lot of the journalism was heavily propaganda in favor of the Allies, right? Which is natural. But Vietnam is one of the first examples of where the press actually went against what the government policy was, and the press started showing a lot of the negative impacts of war. You don't see much of that of the coverage of World War II. There is footage of, you know, planes flying and this, that, and the other thing, but hard-hitting negative stories about what's happening in the war, that's pretty new for Vietnam, right? It's not new anymore. These days, the media lives to destroy politicians. But back in those days, when wartime came along, everybody circled their wagons, and there isn't a lot of negative. And it wasn't like there was censorship. The media was self-censoring and creating positive stuff. Okay, this is something.
Okay, keep writing that down. That's a key point. Big change in people.
Yeah.
And I just want to add to that it's also important, this is really American, right? So
Yeah.
for example, in that time, no one would really see these news here because it was American,
Yeah.
right? And so the landing of the moon, we would watch the Russian landing of the moon.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, so it's also important. Yeah.
Yeah,
How it changed
I
the-
do have quite. There are some pretty good newsreels companies that were UK based that are not some of this American stuff. Every country has its own version of how this evolved. Yeah.
So you found some footage of Vietnam.
Yeah.
And what did you notice about it?
Color. Is it color?
What were you noticing?
It is color.
That's brand new also, actually.
But what are you noticing about it?
Nothing that is like straight from there. It's
Yeah.
not cut or anything.
So you found like a series of uncut raw footage from Vietnam, which is really easy. It's common time because so many people were able to be like they had news reporters like alongside on the front
Embedded.
line. Yeah.
Which is also super common today.
At the time. New.
New-ish. So, I don't know too much about this clip, other than it has something to do with 9/11, and I'm
Yeah.
supposed to hit play.
Yep. So
So I'll let Miss Reeb, do you want me to hit play, or do you want to give a little preamble, or?
So now the first thing, guys, is that this, you talk about Vietnam, I love to stay with this. So what you're going to see, this is the first time that because you're not listening. So the first time that the Congress, U.S. Congress realized they need to start actually saving some of the news archives. And what was happening is that it was being lost. So this is about the first time it was really consciously saved. It was the same time that 9/11 happened. Because 9/11 was the first live coverage. We saw live coverage before, but as it's happening, they actually saw images of the event that people were on the ground getting. So that's what this is going to explain. In short.
Hopefully. Is that
Right?
New from Recorded Memory, the 9/11 Television News Archive Conference. I'm Howard Besser. I'm director of NYU's Moving Image Archiving and Preservation Master's Degree Program. This event is co-sponsored by our NYU Cinema Studies Department and the Internet Archive. This event is really kind of a last-minute put-together event. Just a little bit about the origins. Brewster Kahle and I ran into each other in a frequent flyer lounge about 2 months ago, and we started talking about what we could do around this stuff. And he immediately got me Skyping with people in the Internet Archive from the frequent flyer lounge, and, planning all this stuff. And then just about a month ago, we actually sat down and started concretely planning this event. So all of this is really last minute planning and the gathering of speakers and things within the last month. So this program, the idea that we had a month ago was to highlight a few of the wide range of scholarly lenses that can be used to look at this type of television material. But the antecedent was much earlier, really in Brewster's vision of creating an archive of vast numbers of daily television recordings. As we all know, television shapes and frames the way we look at things, from clothing and dress to gender relations and stereotypes to public policy issues. And though TV is the key medium of the late 20th and early 21st century, it's been incredibly difficult to study. Much television material hasn't been saved at all, and accessing what little was saved has usually required visiting multiple sites across the country or across the world, then viewing scores of tapes from beginning to end in a linear fashion. Not only does the Internet Archive, Television Archive, aggregate all of these in one spot, but it also provides an incredibly effective user interface for browsing such a large collection quickly. And you'll see some of that a little later. And for scholarly research, it provides a way to cite where a set of material is so that other scholars can go back to the same material and either check the veracity of the first scholar's work or build upon it with further research. So this archive is really critically important for scholarship, and that's what this event today is aiming to demonstrate. So just before we get started, I'd like to make a few thanks. First of all, to Alicia Cubes, the coordinator of the media program, who has done an incredible job of support work. To Zach Lister Katz from the on this material, and then of course to all the people who.
Yes, thank you.
So now we're going to get an introduction from Richard Allen.
There's something else you can't do with live TV. Yeah. Fast forward, fast forward, fast forward.
Well, I want to welcome you all to this important conference marking the 10th anniversary of 9/11. I was recently listening to the Hitchcock Truffaut interviews. That was it. Hitchcock Truffaut interviews, which are on recording and they're available on the web. And he needs to drive voice. He was speaking about how I can't tell you but speaking about how it is that 9 out of 10 people, if they're looking over somebody's apartment and they see somebody getting ready to go to bed, will be opposite. 9 out of 10 will not turn away. They will look. It's just human nature. And I remember 9/11 vividly.
Did they know this was going to happen? How were we able to act like those people who actually had their cameras on, like filming something else, and they caught it by chance?
And then I shared with a neighbour the thought.
So he's asking if it's good.
And I began to feel really uncomfortable.
Good, thanks, huh?
That planned, okay, yeah. You'll see the different kinds of footage. That's, I know you can hear him very well. He's discussing how to gather that.
And beginning to speculate on whether or not these buildings are going to fall down and crash into the earth. And I began to feel uncomfortable, and I looked away. And I was the one person, there was my 10, who decided not to look. So I went home, and then what did I do? I switched on the television, and I started watching the end, in the comfort of my own room, comparing channels, looking at various angles of the event, endless reruns and plays to do, and so on. When Howard approached me with the proposal that MEAC host this conference, collaboration with the Television News Archive, it seemed not only ideal for the department, an ideal way of marking this crucial moment, but also to develop the mission of our moving image archiving and preservation program itself, because we're committed here not only to training scholars in the techniques and practices of preservation, but also to develop pedagogy,
Kind of skip over and look at the actual
research,
archives. So we fast forward when we start showing what actually happened on that day, which is
That was the end. That was 8 minutes. Where'd it go? I got the other ones though. Wait. 2?
this one you see. I sent you the wrong one.
Learning from recorded memory, the 9/11 television news
There's
archive.
3 copies of the same thing.
I mean,
Sorry.
yeah. I think a couple interesting things that did come out of that video. Number one, television is so hard to study. And you don't really think about it. Television is ephemeral in nature, or at least it used to be. Ephemeral means it comes and it goes, right? It's not generally intended to be kept over long periods of time. So it's so hard to study if you want to go back and study what's happened in the past. The other pivotal thing, I think we're probably going to discuss more probably next day, is the change of television news that happens when you put a video camera in every human being's pocket in the entire world. How that changes the collection of news. And you'll see CNN right now, and that's sort of the next step that we haven't talked about. We've been focused on broadcast journalism. But the 24-hour news cycle, you see CNN, they do this iReport thing. Half of the footage that CNN uses isn't collected by journalists. It's collected just by random people with phones in their pocket. Most of what you see on 24-hour news stations these days are actually filmed by average people in the streets, whether it's footage of Egypt or Syria or whatever. These aren't journalists with giant cameras walking around. These are like people with phones. And that really has changed fundamentally, like how is news collected? Who is a journalist and who is not a journalist? And it's become really fuzzy. We're all journalists. Citizens are journalists now. Whoops.
Well, it's on this